My name is Elena. If you are sitting down with a cup of coffee right now, maybe watching the rain hit your window, or just trying to find a quiet moment after a long day, I want you to take a breath and listen closely. I want to ask you a question that took me nearly 30 years to answer for myself. Have you ever been the designated failure in your own family? Have you ever walked into a room full of your own flesh and blood, only to realize that the version of you they talk about, the clumsy, unsuccessful, dramatic version, is completely made up? For almost a decade, that was my reality. In the eyes of my parents, Richard and Eleanor, and my golden child brother, Julian, I was the family disgrace. I was the daughter with the boring, invisible desk job, who couldn't seem to live up to their pristine corporate standards. They never asked about the long weeks I spent staring at complex ledger sheets, or the federal fraud cases I helped close, or the fact that my quiet work put real corporate thieves behind bars. To them, my life was just an empty space where a successful career should have been. They built a mirror, held it up to my face, and forced me to look at a broken reflection of myself every single day. And for a long time, the worst part was that I almost believed them. But everything changed on a completely ordinary Tuesday morning. The clock on my nightstand read exactly 6:14 a.m. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, and the house was dead silent. My phone buzzed on the glass tabletop, a sharp, sudden vibration that made my chest tighten before I even picked it up. When I tapped the screen, there were no missed calls. There was just a single text message from my 78-year-old grandmother, Ava. 4 words, that was all it said. The winter ferns are freezing. To anyone else browsing through their phone over breakfast, it would have looked like a mistake. A sweet, slightly confused text from an elderly woman worrying about her porch plants during a cold snap. But, to me, those 4 words felt like a bucket of ice water dumped directly onto my chest. My hands started to shake so badly I almost dropped the phone. You see, 3 years ago, after a case I worked on involving a vulnerable older policyholder whose own family had drained her life savings, Grandma Ava and I sat down at her kitchen table. We talked about how easily the people who are supposed to protect you can turn into the people you need protection from. Right there, over a plate of her homemade shortbread, we created a secret distress code. It was a pact, a solemn promise made between 2 women who knew exactly how cruel our family dynamic could be. She looked me dead in the eyes that afternoon and said, "Elena, if I ever send you this specific phrase, it means I am being controlled. It means someone is holding the door shut, or monitoring my calls, or forcing me to do something against my will. Promise me you won't call the house. Promise me you will just come." Sitting there in the dim light of my bedroom at 6:14 a.m., I realized the trap had finally snapped shut around her. I didn't hesitate. I didn't call my father to check in, and I didn't send a casual text back to see if she was joking. I threw on my heavy jacket, grabbed my keys, and called local emergency services while sprinting down the stairs to my car. As the engine roared to life, I forced my voice to stay completely level, using the exact clinical, precise tone I use when presenting financial crimes to a federal prosecutor. I gave the dispatcher the address, explained that an elderly woman was in immediate physical and legal danger, and told them I would be at the front door in exactly 10 minutes. If you have ever had to quietly step up and become the protector of your own boundaries, if you have ever had to save someone you love from the very people who claim to care for them, type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Let me know where you are watching this from, because I need to know how far this story travels. To understand exactly what happened when I arrived at that house, you have to understand the invisible blueprint of my family. Every toxic family has an architecture, a rigid set of rules about who is allowed to be smart, who is allowed to be successful, and who has to carry the blame for everything that goes wrong. In our house, my brother Julian was the crown jewel. He was a corporate attorney, polished, smooth-talking, and pristine. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, treated his every word like scripture. He was the child who made something of himself, the one who wore tailored suits and spoke the language of high-stakes contracts. And then there was me. I was the quiet one. I didn't major in corporate law. I studied forensic accounting. To my parents, that wasn't a real profession. They didn't understand that forensic accounting isn't about moving numbers around a spreadsheet. It's about hunting. It's about looking at a pristine facade, a wall of beautifully falsified documents, and finding the one thread that unravels the entire lie. Because my work was highly confidential and often involved ongoing federal investigations, I couldn't come home and brag about my day at the dinner table. I couldn't tell them about the corporate executives I helped indict or the hidden offshore accounts I mapped out for law enforcement. So, they filled the silence with their own narrative. They told everyone that I had a boring, dead-end clerical desk job. They used my quietness as proof that I had no ambition, no future, and nothing worth respecting. I remember one evening so clearly. It still sits in the back of my mind like a sharp piece of glass. It was Julian's graduation from law school. We were all at a high-end restaurant, and my father stood up to make a grand toast. He talked about Julian's brilliant mind, his bright future, and how he was the true pride of the family name. During a lull in the conversation, Grandma Ava gently mentioned that I had just been promoted to a senior examiner position at my firm, handling multi-million-dollar fraud cases. My father didn't even look at me. He just let out a short, patronizing laugh, waved his hand, and said, "Oh, Elena's cute little paperwork project? It's nice she has a safe office to sit in, but let's focus on real careers tonight." Julian smiled into his wine glass. My mother immediately changed the subject to Julian's upcoming bar exam. That was the exact moment I realized the profound difference between being useful to a family's public image and being genuinely wanted for who you actually are. To them, I was only useful as a contrast. They needed me to be the unsuccessful, struggling daughter so that Julian could look even brighter by comparison. If you've ever sat at a family dinner table and felt completely invisible, if you've ever realized that your own parents are actively invested in watching you fail just to prove themselves right, you know exactly how that casual, smiling cruelty can leave a scar. But what my family completely failed to realize was that while they were busy mocking my cute little paperwork project, they were actively training the very person who would eventually dismantle their entire lives. They thought my silence was weakness. They had absolutely no idea it was actually my greatest asset. The real tragedy of a toxic family dynamic isn't just how they treat the person at the bottom of the ladder. It's how they predatory shift their focus whenever a new opportunity for control presents itself. For years, Grandma Ava had been my safe harbor. She was a fiercely independent woman who owned a beautiful historic home completely free of debt, along with a sizable retirement portfolio left by my grandfather. She was the only person in that family who ever looked past my quiet exterior and truly saw me. But 8 months ago, everything began to shift. Grandma Ava suffered a minor health scare. A mild hip surgery that required a brief period of rehabilitation. It wasn't something that stripped her of her sharp mind, but it did make her physically vulnerable for a few short weeks. That was all the opening my parents and Julian needed. Under the guise of absolute devotion and saintly caregiving, Richard and Eleanor quietly packed their bags and moved directly into her estate. They told the rest of the extended family that they were sacrificing their own comfort to make sure Ava was looked after. It sounded so beautiful. It sounded like the ultimate act of familial love. But because of my training as a fraud investigator, I am conditioned to look at patterns, not promises. And very quickly, the patterns at Grandma's house began to change. First, it was the digital wall. When I would call Grandma's landline, my mother would almost always answer, her voice dripping with a forced, sweet concern as she told me Ava was too tired to speak or resting after her medication. Then, they changed the password to her online banking portals. They claimed it was to protect her from online scammers, but to me, it felt like a cage being built bar by bar. Next came the social isolation. My mother began systematically canceling Grandma's weekly lunches with her lifelong friends. She would call them up and subtly hint that Ava was becoming increasingly forgetful and found social gatherings highly confusing and stressful. They were creating a false public narrative. They were actively seeding the idea that Ava was losing her mental capacity, laying the psychological groundwork to justify taking complete control over her entire life. I remember visiting the house about 3 weeks before that fateful Tuesday morning. As soon as I walked through the door, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost claustrophobic. Grandma Ava was sitting in the corner of the living room, and every time I asked her a direct question about how she was feeling or what she had been doing, my father would instantly step into the conversation, answering for her with a patronizing chuckle. "Oh, you know how your grandmother is these days, Elena," he would say, patting her shoulder while his eyes stayed cold and calculating. "She gets a little mixed up about the days of the week." I watched Grandma's face closely in that moment. She didn't look confused. She looked terrified. Her eyes flicked down toward a stack of heavy legal manila folders sitting on the dining room table, and then she quickly looked away, pressing her lips together into a thin, tight line. My father noticed my gaze drift toward those documents and immediately shifted his body to block my view, changing the subject back to Julian's latest courtroom victory. That was the exact moment the internal alarms went off in my head. I knew the signs of financial grooming. I knew what it looked like right before an elder exploitation scheme reached its final devastating stage. They thought they were being incredibly clever, spinning a web of caregiving that no one would dare question. But they forgot that I spend 40 hours a week untangling webs exactly like theirs. 10 minutes after that text message dropped into my life, my car slammed to a halt at the curb in front of my grandmother's house. The dawn air was crisp, and the blue and red emergency lights of the 2 arriving police cruisers cut through the early morning fog, casting sharp, rhythmic shadows across the manicured front lawn. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but as I stepped out onto the asphalt, my professional programming clicked into place. I wasn't just a panicked granddaughter anymore. I was a senior financial fraud investigator approaching a compromised scene. I knew exactly how crucial the first 60 seconds of a confrontation were. I stood on the front porch with Sergeant Elena Ruiz and Officer Grant flanking me. When I knocked on the heavy oak door, it didn't open immediately. There was a long, deliberate pause behind the glass before the brass deadbolt slowly clicked over. My father, Richard, stood in the doorway. He was wearing an expensive fleece pullover, holding a ceramic coffee mug, and his face instantly twisted into that familiar, patronizing expression he had spent 30 years perfecting. The exact same smirk he used whenever he called me dramatic or useless. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth, completely devoid of surprise. He looked past my shoulder at the uniform officers, his eyes narrowing just a fraction before a practiced smile smoothed out his features. "Officers, Good morning. I assume my daughter has dragged you out here on another one of her wild, over-emotional tangents? We're actually in the middle of family breakfast. Before I could even speak, my mother, Eleanor, appeared directly behind him. Her face was perfectly composed, but her knuckles were white around the edges of Grandma Ava's silver smartphone, which she was holding firmly in her left hand. In her right hand, tucked tightly under her arm, was a thick manila folder bursting with legal documents. Seeing those officers didn't make them panic. It made them calculate. My mother stepped forward, her voice dripping with a carefully manufactured, exhausted grief that would have fooled anyone who hadn't studied narcissistic manipulation. "Officers, please excuse Elena," she said, letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "It's a deeply painful family matter. My mother, Ava, has been suffering from severe cognitive decline and dementia. Elena has always struggled to accept reality, and she's become increasingly volatile and resentful about her own career failures. She's been harassing us for weeks because she's obsessed with an inheritance she thinks she's losing." The lie was delivered with such flawless sociopathic precision that for one highly dangerous second, the entire scene transformed into exactly what my parents wanted the world to see. Two selfless, exhausted caregivers being actively harassed by an unstable, vindictive daughter. I've investigated dozens of staged corporate claims, and I knew exactly what they were doing. It's a psychological tactic called narrative framing. Give people a simple, emotionally compelling story before they have time to look at the actual evidence. And most people will blindly accept it because simplicity feels like the truth. Suddenly, a dull, heavy thud echoed from the deep end of the hallway. The distinct sound of something heavy crashing against wood behind a closed door. My father's smooth smile vanished instantly. My mother took a sharp step backward, her eyes darting toward the back of the house. Sergeant Ruiz didn't hesitate. She pushed past my father, her hand resting instinctively on her utility belt as she navigated the narrow corridor. I followed right behind her, my eyes locking onto the door at the very end of the hall. When I reached it, the breath caught completely in my throat. Attached to the outside of the beautiful vintage wood of Grandma Ava's sunroom door was a brand new, heavy-duty commercial deadbolt lock. A literal external lock installed on the outside, trapping a 78-year-old woman inside her own room. It was the undeniable physical proof of what they had been doing. Abuse and exploitation rarely announce themselves with broken windows. They hide behind clean curtains, polite smiles, and external locks disguised as safety measures. Officer Grant stepped up, grabbed the key that my parents had left sitting directly in the exterior cylinder, turned it with a loud, metallic click, and threw the door wide open. The door swung back against the baseboard, and the dim morning light revealed a scene that made my chest tighten. My grandmother, Ava, was sitting on the hardwood floor beside a heavy, overturned wicker chair. Despite the humid summer warmth clinging to the house, she was wearing a thick wool cardigan. As she shifted her arm toward the light, the sleeve rode up just an inch, exposing a dark, sickeningly distinct purple bruise blooming across the delicate skin of her wrist. Scattered all around her slippers were pages of legal contracts, heavily marked with bright yellow sticky tabs. When her eyes met mine, she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She slowly raised her right hand and pressed two fingers firmly against her heart. That single, quiet motion was our confirmation signal. It meant, "I am perfectly lucid." I sent the text intentionally. "Do not let them turn this into a medical emergency." My mother lunged forward into the room, her voice rising into a sharp, hysterical pitch. "Ava, oh my goodness, look at you! Officers, you see? She wanders, she knocks things over, she's completely unsafe. The external lock was a temporary safety recommendation because she keeps trying to escape into the street at night. But Sergeant Ruiz stepped in, her solid frame completely blocking my mother's path. "Ma'am, back up. Please step completely out of the hallway and remain in the living room." That was when my brother Julian walked through the front door. He didn't look like a man whose parents had just been caught running an elder abuse cage. He walked in with his leather briefcase, his posture completely straight, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked at the police officers, then looked at me, and let out a cold, calculated sigh. "Elena, I suggest you think very carefully about the circus you're starting here," Julian said, his voice entirely level, adopting his best courtroom tone. He looked at Sergeant Ruiz. "Officer, my name is Julian Anderson. I'm a corporate attorney, and I represent my parents. What you're looking at is a deeply unfortunate case of an estranged, financially unstable sibling attempting to weaponize a welfare check. My sister has been unemployed for months, obsessed with true crime narratives, and is entirely resentful of my family's financial security." He pulled a stapled document from his briefcase, holding it out to Officer Grant. "This is a draft petition for an emergency ex parte guardianship over Ava Anderson, which we are filing in probate court at 9 o'clock this morning. We have multiple signed affidavits from her primary care physician and her family detailing her severe cognitive decline. My sister is trying to manipulate an elderly estate woman into altering her estate plan because she wants an inheritance she hasn't earned." He stepped closer to me, his voice dropping into a low, menacing whisper meant only for my ears. "We've been tracking you for 6 months, Elena. Every time you lost your temper at Sunday dinners, every time you slammed a door or shouted about how unfair we were. We logged it. We have a full psychological timeline of your volatile behavior. The moment you raise your voice in front of these officers, you play right into our hands. Go ahead. Scream at us. Prove to the judge exactly what we wrote in that petition." It was an incredibly sophisticated, ruthless trap. Julian wasn't a cartoon villain who was going to break down and confess because a cop was in the room. He was a professional manipulator who had spent months building a legal fortress around their crime. They had designed a game where my natural protective anger would be used as the ultimate evidence to strip Grandma of her rights and lock me out of her life forever. If you have ever dealt with a narcissist who knows exactly how to push your buttons just to stand back and call you the crazy one when you finally react, type control in the comments right now. I looked at Julian's smooth, arrogant face. I felt the hot, familiar surge of childhood rage climbing up my throat. But I looked back at Grandma Ava, who was watching me with absolute focus. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger pass through me without obeying it. I turned my back on Julian, knelt down on the floor beside my grandmother without touching a single piece of the scattered paperwork, and kept my voice completely soft, calm, and professional. "Grandma," I whispered, looking directly into her clear, sharp eyes. "Are you hurt? And do you feel safe speaking to these officers alone?" Grandma Ava looked straight past my brother, her eyes locked onto mine with a clarity that no fraudulent medical affidavit could ever erase. "My wrist," she said, her voice small but perfectly steady, ensuring the officers heard every syllable. "And they would not let me leave this house." With those two phrases, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The officers stopped treating the morning as a chaotic family dispute and began treating the residence as an active crime scene. Sergeant Ruiz ordered my parents and Julian back into the kitchen, separating us completely to preserve individual statements. While the paramedics arrived to examine Grandma's wrist, I retreated to my car, pulled out my laptop, and contacted Sophia Reed, my closest friend, and a brilliant digital forensics specialist. Unlike my family, Sophia knew exactly what I did for a living. She didn't see a clerical desk clerk. She knew I was a senior examiner certified in tracing hidden corporate assets. "Elena," she said as soon as she picked up, her voice sharp with professional focus. "If Julian signed that guardianship petition, you have to assume every single asset your grandmother owns is actively being drained right now. We need to map the transaction trail before the courts open." For the next 4 hours, sitting in the front seat of my car while police guarded the house, Sophia and I initiated a full-scale forensic audit. Before the police removed her, Grandma had managed to whisper a crucial detail to me. "The basement account is real, Elena. And Julian cannot know you have the key." My family had spent years calling me unsuccessful, using that insult like a psychological leash to keep me small and desperate for their approval. But as I began digging into the digital footprint of my grandmother's accounts, I uncovered a file that made my stomach turn. It was a digital copy of a corporate strategy sheet Julian had created, titled Family Contingencies. I stared at the glowing screen, my eyes tracing the lines of text my own brother had written. He had meticulously documented every single one of my psychological wounds. He noted the exact dates when I had worked out of state, my periods of financial stress early in my career, and the specific arguments that made me lose my temper. At the very bottom of the document, my mother had typed a line that chilled me to the bone. "Keep calling her unsuccessful. She needs to prove herself to us, and people who are desperate to prove themselves always make mistakes." It was a profound, devastating realization. Their cruelty hadn't been careless outbursts of anger. It was an active, calculated corporate strategy. They had spent a decade intentionally pressing on my insecurities, trying to provoke an emotional breakdown so they could use my reactions as legal leverage to prove I was mentally unstable. They needed me to look crazy so no one would listen to my warnings about what they were doing to Ava. But as the data began to compile on my screen, the heavy emotional weight of their betrayal transformed into something cold, clinical, and completely immovable. I stopped hurting. I started analyzing. They wanted a sister who acted out of childhood pain, but instead, they had pulled a senior fraud investigator directly into their private ledgers. Sophia and I successfully uncovered a complex web of shell companies, limited liability corporations registered in Delaware under Julian's corporate address. By tracing the bank routing numbers, we found the true meaning of the basement account. It wasn't an offshore bank portal. It was an off-grid, physical ledger tracking exactly $426,000 that had been systematically siphoned out of Grandma Ava's primary savings and retirement funds over the last 8 months. The money wasn't just sitting in an account. It was actively being positioned to fund a massive luxury lifestyle, upgrade for my parents, a business loan for Julian, and a down payment on a private condominium in Florida. They had built a complete roadmap for her ruin, and they were exactly 24 hours away from finalizing a home equity loan that would drain the remaining equity of her historic estate. I closed the laptop with a quiet snap. The emotional manipulation was over. The game was no longer being played on their terms, in a house where they could look down on me and call me useless. We were moving to a courtroom, and on a legal chessboard, numbers don't lie, and they never care about a narcissist's smile. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the atmosphere in the probate courtroom was thick with the smell of old wood polish and tension. My parents and Julian arrived looking absolutely pristine, wearing the kind of expensive, conservative clothing designed to broadcast stability and responsibility to a judge. They sat together behind the plaintiff's table, presenting a united, unbreakable front. Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the exhausted, grieving daughter. Richard kept his head slightly bowed, exuding a quiet, noble suffering. Julian stood at the podium to present his emergency guardianship petition. His voice was smooth, measured, and entirely compelling. He spent 15 minutes carefully dissecting my character, portraying me to the judge as an estranged, emotionally volatile, and casually employed daughter who had shown up out of nowhere to disrupt a medically necessary care plan. He presented the staged affidavits, arguing that Grandma Ava's dementia was so severe that she could no longer safely make financial decisions, and that my disruptive intervention was a blatant attempt to secure access to her estate. I sat at the defense table next to Leo Marston, an elite elder law attorney Grandma Ava had secretly hired months prior. When it was our turn to speak, I didn't stand up and start shouting. I didn't try to defend my childhood or argue about how cruel my family had always been. I simply let Leo stand up and deliver the most devastating logic twist they could have ever anticipated. "Your Honor," Leo began, his voice ringing clearly across the quiet room, "the petitioner has spent a considerable amount of time outlining why Miss Elena Anderson is unfit to manage the affairs of her grandmother's estate. We completely agree. In fact, Miss Anderson is not seeking custody. She is not seeking guardianship. She holds absolutely zero power of attorney, and she is not named as a financial agent on a single one of Ava Anderson's accounts." You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. Julian's head snapped up. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his practiced frown deepening into genuine confusion. "We are not here to dispute family dynamics," Leo continued, sliding a thick stack of certified documents across the judge's bench. "We are here because Miss Elena Anderson is not casually employed, as her brother suggested. She is a senior federal fraud examiner with a decade of specialized experience in identifying elder exploitation, complex corporate shell companies, and forged financial instruments. And what she uncovered yesterday morning is not a medical dispute. It is a meticulously coordinated $426,000 theft." The blood completely drained from Julian's face. The entire foundation of their legal strategy, that I was a crazy, unstable daughter trying to steal money, collapsed. The second the court realized I wasn't fighting for control of the estate, I was testifying as an expert witness to a crime. Leo then introduced the certified medical evaluations, confirming Ava's full cognitive competence, the photographs of the external lock installed on the sunroom door, and the meticulously mapped transaction trail, tracing the exact route of the stolen funds from Ava's retirement accounts directly into the Delaware LLCs controlled by Julian and Richard. But my family was incredibly stubborn. Even with the forensic evidence stacked against them, Julian stood back up, regaining his composure. "Your Honor, these transactions were fully authorized estate planning strategies, legally executed with a certified notary. We have signed documents from Ava proving her consent. The claims of coercion are entirely circumstantial. He thought he was safe because he believed the only witness against them was an elderly woman he had already painted as delusional. But he was fundamentally underestimating the true mastermind of this entire operation. He thought I was the one pulling the strings to save my grandmother. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply following the roadmap that Grandma Ava had spent half a year perfectly designing." The courtroom grew cold as Leo Marston pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive and plugged it directly into the defense lectern's media player. He looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner claims that these asset transfers were fully authorized and that the witnesses' statements are circumstantial. I would like to introduce the primary evidence, securely archived by Miss Ava Anderson herself." Julian's eyes darted toward the television monitors hanging on the courtroom walls. Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles turned a bloodless white. Suddenly, a sound file began to play. The audio was pristine, crisp, and entirely unmistakable. It was my mother, Eleanor's voice, echoing through the chamber, stripped of all her gentle, maternal warmth. Once the emergency guardianship is signed by the judge, she can object all she wants. No one listens to an old woman after a court rules her incompetent. We just need her to sign this final home equity loan application before Friday. Then, my father, Richard's voice cut in, low and calculating. And Elena will help us build the case without even knowing it. Every time she loses her temper and shouts at us, she proves our point to the court. Keep pushing her buttons. Let her play the hero while we take the house. The courtroom was frozen in absolute silence. My mother let out a sharp, choked gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Julian stood entirely paralyzed at the podium, his mouth slightly open, his highly trained legal mind completely failing to find a single objection to stop the recording. But the final blow didn't come from my parents' recorded conversation. The audio shifted, playing a clip recorded just 3 weeks prior in the sunroom. You could hear the rustle of papers and Julian's voice, cold and demanding. Sign it, Ava. Your name goes right here on the line. If you don't, we will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a state-run facility where Elena will never find you. This is an illegal recording, Julian finally shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he slammed his hand down on the podium. Wiretapping is a felony. This evidence is completely inadmissible. Leo Marston didn't even blink. He calmly presented another document to the judge. Your Honor, 6 months ago, after realizing her mail was being intercepted and her passwords were being changed, Ava Anderson retained my services. Under state law, an individual has the absolute right to record conversations occurring inside their own primary residence for their security and protection. This audio was captured via an encrypted, legally compliant recording archive built directly into Miss Ava's medical alert pendant, a device my clients mistakenly dismissed as an old woman's accessory. The logic trap had snapped completely shut. My family had spent a decade building a meticulously designed narrative that I was a broken, useless failure, and they had spent 8 months trying to paint my grandmother as a helpless, delusional victim. But the truth was entirely the opposite. Grandma Ava wasn't a passive victim waiting for an over-emotional granddaughter to come rescue her. She was the architect of the entire sting operation. She had used their own arrogance against them. She knew they looked down on her. She knew they treated her like a piece of property to be traded, and she used that exact contempt to gather every single piece of evidence required to destroy them. She didn't want me to act out of childhood anger. She needed me to remain perfectly disciplined, to bring the authorities, and to act as the objective, professional forensic witness who could verify the data she had secretly gathered. The judge looked down at Julian from the bench, her expression filled with a cold, unyielding disgust. She didn't just deny their guardianship petition. She instantly ordered a complete freeze on every single account associated with Julian's LLCs, initiated an immediate emergency protective order removing my parents from Ava's property, and directed the entire file to the state prosecutor's office for immediate criminal prosecution for elder exploitation, grand theft, and forgery. The justice that followed wasn't a sudden, cinematic explosion of anger. It was the slow, rhythmic turning of a legal wheel that my family could no longer stall. The state prosecutor took the evidence from Grandma Ava's pendant and the forensic maps I built, and they systematically dismantled my parents' and brothers' lives. There were no explosive screaming matches in the driveway, no dramatic movie confrontations. There was just the cold, clinical sound of handcuffs clicking, asset liquidation notices, and the quiet tearing of Julian's law license being permanently revoked by the state bar. The luxury Florida condominium they had planned to buy with Grandma's life savings vanished into federal restitution orders. The expensive vehicles were repossessed from the driveway. And my father lost his prestigious seat on the community foundation board. Every single piece of the future they had meticulously designed, using a vulnerable woman's stolen wealth, became the exact financial instrument used to repay her. Julian pleaded guilty to financial exploitation and falsification of documents to avoid maximum prison time, accepting a sentence that stripped him of his freedom, his career, and his standing. My parents followed shortly after, their pristine corporate reputation permanently replaced by a public criminal record. Before their sentencing hearings, I received individual letters from both of them. My mother wrote a long, rambling note about how families should never destroy one another over simple financial misunderstandings. My father wrote a letter praising my intelligence, telling me he always knew I was capable of greatness, and asking me to help him shift the blame entirely onto my mother. Even in their absolute defeat, their words were still transactional. They still wanted to use me. Neither of them asked how Grandma's bruised wrist had healed, or what it felt like for a 78-year-old woman to be locked behind a deadbolt inside her own home. I never replied. I filed the letters directly into the evidence boxes where they belonged. A few months later, I stood on the porch of a small, sunlit house just 3 blocks away from my own. Grandma Ava had toured 6 different places before choosing this one entirely on her own terms, using her independent funds. She had resumed her weekly lunches with her lifelong friends, hired a completely neutral, professional fiduciary to manage her assets, and established a private foundation that helps vulnerable older adults obtain independent legal reviews before signing power of attorney documents. As I watched her move through her new garden, planting a row of fresh, vibrant blue roses beside the walkway, the last lingering weight of my childhood trauma finally fell away. For 30 years, I had carried the painful illusion that I was the abandoned, useless daughter who desperately needed to achieve something monumental just to earn a seat at my parents' table. But looking at Ava, I finally understood the truth. She hadn't saved me by controlling my life, and she hadn't asked me to become a weapon for her revenge. She had simply given me a safe, quiet space to find my own strength, trusting that when the moment came, my discipline would outweigh my anger. People often call what we did revenge. I understand why they use that word. My parents and brother mocked my career, built an entire legal strategy around my supposed uselessness, and then watched those exact same investigative skills completely dismantle their freedom. But as I sit here finishing my coffee, I can tell you honestly, that the most satisfying moment wasn't watching the judge hand down the sentences. It was watching my grandmother unlock her own front door, drop the brass key safely into her purse, and decide entirely for herself who was welcome inside her home. Real revenge isn't about making the people who hurt you feel small. It's about building a life so beautifully secure that they can never make you, or the people you love, as powerless ever again. I've stopped explaining my career to relatives who only values prestige. I've stopped treating professional success as an appeal for parental love. And I've become far more attentive to the quiet, ordinary signals that families so easily overlook. So I want to leave you with one final question to think about today. If someone only confesses to hurting you after they realize their lies will no longer protect them, do they truly deserve a place in your life? Forgiveness might someday free your heart from anger, but it will never require you to reopen the door to the people who tried to lock you out of your own reality. Thank you for sitting with me and being a part of this journey today. Remember, as you move forward into your own week, you don't ever need to rush your healing or pretend that the scars don't ache. You only need to keep choosing your own peace, one quiet step at a time, until living in the truth feels completely natural again.